as possible, but our experts will also be able to answer queries both online and after the presentation, so keep them coming. Right, without further ado, I'll hand you over to Amandeep Jawar, Audit Director with Service Matters. Amandeep, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Apologies. Apologies. Thank you very much for the introduction. I've got 15 minutes to spend with yourself, with colleagues within the sector, to talk about my experiences of investigating, but also dealing with kind of social housing fraud. I'm going to concentrate on the frauds that happen within organisations, and Mark will pick up the specific issue around tenancy fraud, which I'm sure we're all aware of. I'm going to apologise in advance. I normally have about half an hour to 45 minutes to deliver this type of session, so it's going to be a whistle-stop tour as I go through this. However, as Martin detailed earlier, I will try and get through as many of the Q&As as I can, and if that's not possible, feel free to contact myself after if you think there's some unexplored areas that you want to look through. So, for me, this session really is about kind of looking and disseminating some of my experiences around dealing with social housing fraud. I used to work for an organisation which provided these services to housing organisations. About 8-9 years ago, I came into the housing sector and I kind of led on anti-fraud management. Martin kind of hit on briefly around my experience of drawing up a tenancy fraud strategy in Birmingham, amongst other things. So the first thing I really want to talk about is something around the profiles of a fraudster. And I'm going to use some work that KPMG recently released and kind of link that to my experience of delivering some fraud investigation with the housing sector. I want to then talk through the kind of type of frauds that we have within our sector. And I purposely chose a few because there's a kind of high level of variety amongst them. And when I presented this before, some of these kind of frauds, people have taken a step back and thought, oh, I've never thought of that. I'm then going to kind of quickly flick through about the kind of high level areas around protecting an organisation from fraud, in this case social housing. And finally I'll kind of pass over to Mark, who will then have 10 minutes to talk about the tenancy fraud element. Okay. As you can see from this slide, the profile of the fraudster, I picked up the highlights from the KPMG report. And the reason I did that was, when I read through it, I thought, wow, that's pretty much my experience within the housing sector when I've dealt with particular types of fraud. So, you know, the age is there and thereabouts. What's interesting is there's no real distinction between male and female. And, you know, the number I've investigated over the years, that's my experience of it as well. You've then got, you know, 61% of fraudsters are employed by an organisation. And 41% of these have been there for a number of years. I mean, what's quite interesting is you would, on the face of it, consider these individuals to be trusted within the organisation, and yet they take the majority of the fraud statistics here. Frauds, again, involve collusion. I mean, that's quite risky for fraudster to get involved and maybe go out and speak to other individuals within the organisation or externally to try and kind of commit a fraud. And kind of that opens up the questions around how well your organisation is around dealing with confidential reporting, whistleblowing, and the culture around that. And as you can see from the last two figures, nothing surprising there. Fraud really are around misappropriation of assets or actually income gain, asset gain. So, you know, it's something that was quite interesting. For me, what I quite like is the analysis around why frauds happen, and particularly around individuals. So, you know, why do people commit frauds? Well, one is there's a change in circumstances which creates an opportunity. And, you know, for me, one experience that I've had was an individual who worked in a scheme for a number of years who, for no reason of her own, her partner became unemployed. And after 25 years of exemplary performance at this organisation, she found herself in debt, her partner in debt, and an opportunity came to take some money out of the safe, which was discovered, and lo and behold, that was her career done. You've then got the old adage around just greed, and financial greed is a lead on that. And what's quite interesting about that is, fraud isn't about whether you have no money or you don't have enough money, you want more money. Those who already have money still commit fraud. So there's no real kind of profiling around poorer and the more wealthier within our sector. You then kind of talk about the rationality, and I've purposely kind of picked out the statistics around 29% of fraud committed by exec directors. Apologies if there's any out there at the moment. But again, it's a kind of interesting point that there's that kind of human nature and your own kind of sense of personality that sometimes comes to this, regardless of whether you need some benefits from that financial gain or not. The next slide, what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this statistics here, take this profiling and link it to one of the largest investigations I undertook within the housing sector a number of years ago. And it related to a maintenance manager who was aged 38. So he sat quite nicely in the profile. He was working for this organisation for 8 years, and his fraud involved collusion with a third-party contractor. What was interesting is once I started this investigation and we had discussions with the individual around this, it's quite clear that his rationale for the fraud was that he was overlooked for promotion. So in his words, he was owed it, he should have got promoted, and he's only taking back what was owed to him. The opportunity for him was actually, he realised that he was working in an area where there's weak internal controls. So very simply, he could commission work, he could approve the work and sign off the invoice. So he saw that. And his motivation, actually, at the end, was financial greed. This particular fraud took over a period of 5 years. So after 3 years joining the organisation, we estimated about £1.3 million of fraud occurred. And that was through him becoming a silent partner on a maintenance company and then commissioning work for this maintenance company without any checks or balances or going through the right processes. The right of the presentation, I've got about 7, 8, 9 bullet points there. And this is the interesting part of what I feel around fraud detection. These are softer things that you'll see within organisations, particularly those who are subject to fraud, and particularly when they have individuals like this. And really, this individual is working 7 AM to 7 PM each day to hide their tracks. He was actually seen as a popular individual, like the soul of the party, and when there was anything that needed to be done, he would go to this individual and he would be known as the fixer within the organisation. People were aware that he was on a certain salary, in this case it was 32,000 a year, but people in the organisation were also aware that he spent 3 months in South Africa, Australia and Cuba on holiday over a period of 18 months. He turned up to work in a 4x4 valued at about £25,000, and he lived in a house valued at £500,000. So the question back here to yourselves is, if the organisation and people are aware of this, at what point does an organisation look at that and think, actually, is it something that's worth looking at? And these are softer kind of cultural changes within an organisation which will help with anti-fraud awareness. Through my experience of delivering fraud services to the sector, there's kind of 3 ways that you would defraud an organisation. One is you would build relationships within the organisation, be it internal to internal, employee to employee, or external to employee. And on the next few slides, I'll give you some examples of how that's happened. The other way you do it is you just try your luck. You don't know anything about this organisation, you have no idea, but actually I'm just going to see if I'll be able to defraud them. And that mainly happens from external influences, although internally it has happened before. And the third really is you kind of look for system weaknesses within the organisation, or you come across system weaknesses and you exploit those for your own gain. So just concentrate on building close relationships. There's 4 examples I want to just share with you. And one was a lettings manager who took money to manipulate a waiting list. And what happened was that applicants on the waiting list had befriended the lettings manager, had built up quite a good rapport with them, and they got into a relationship. And lo and behold, the individual then, once he'd built up this rapport, gave the lettings manager an opportunity to benefit from moving this individual up the waiting list. So initially the fraudster, who may not have started as a fraudster but identified an issue, used this relationship to exploit for their own gain. Same again, there was a supplier for a housing provider who did low-level work, not a great deal of work for the supplier, befriended the finance officer and asked the individual, once he got to know him, to amend checks. So maybe the organisation, he was going to get paid £300. He would ask the individual to kind of amend that check and put it for £3,000. So again, something around using close relationships and those people who are in that position to be able to influence it. Getting away from finance, we look at housing officers. And there was an example where a housing officer helped a tenant through an eviction process, and this tenant, was quite built up a report to the housing officer who would support him through quite a difficult time. What had happened then is there's a period of 30 days before the tenant had to clear the items out of their own house. And what had happened is during that 30-day period, the housing officer had gone back to the housing office, collected the keys, and tried to walk out with the television. So he's aware that his tenant had a 40-inch flat screen. Luckily, there was a vigilant neighbour who had stopped him, and we looked into that. But again, the housing officer had built this relationship, built this rapport, and used it to exploit for an opportunity for fraud. And finally, my favourite, and this doesn't relate to Orbit, I can assure you that. It was last year's CEO who befriended a number of individuals on the waiting list, and in exchange for this friendship, is probably the best I can say it, he moved them to the waiting list and actually gave them properties. And when we did this investigation, we identified 4 of these individuals across the board. So just a very quick kind of run through around one way you can defraud an organisation is to build relationships with key individuals and influencers within your sector. The second type is just I call it try my luck. And this is really about nobody knowing about your organisation, apart from the fact that they know you exist. So in the top left corner you see 500,000 invoices. That is no different to an email scam. So these individuals up in the northwest had targeted a number of organisations, a number of them in the housing, and just sent them invoices in marketing and communications area, because there's no real product and tangible thing around that. And they basically made £500,000 they received £500,000 of payment through this approach. There's one organisation I worked for, they were defrauded £5,000, and what was interesting was, because they signed off the first invoice, they got a second invoice from this fraudster who would have thought, actually, they're a weak system. Just moving to the right, you then talk about the tenant account and the £6,000. And what that was a criminal who lived in and around the stock of this organisation. And he had identified that actually, if he went and spoke to some of the social housing tenants and said to them, I'll pay off your rent, can you put this money into your tenant account? So this tenant could then build up a credit, 2 to 3 months later, ask for a cheque refund, and use the tenant account to clean some of the ill-gotten gains from his business. And what was interesting about that was the tenant themselves were vulnerable, they were in arrears, and the actual individual had identified this and used this individual to clean their money, so to speak. Bottom left, again, this is about a tenant who sat on a procurement exercise. And what the tenant decided to do then was to sell the tender data to a potential bidder. He had no idea how it would go. He went to see him. Unfortunately, in this case, the supplier who was asked to buy the information contacted us and did that. And again, we need to be careful around understanding the kind of risks in the business of where these kind of things can happen. And finally, the kind of fourth one in the bottom right is really around, we live in a digital world at the moment, and there's all sorts of transactions happen digitally. And a few years back, an organisation was hacked externally, and their tenant data was taken. And it was actually found out sooner or later it was sold to loan companies. So again, there's this type of fraud where people won't know who you are, you won't have any idea who they are, but actually they will try and penetrate you. Final one I want to just quickly pick up on is around manipulating current systems. And there's a couple of examples on the side. I'm going to kind of bunch the two up together on the left. And really what that was about was there were systems in place to check people's procurement cards, their transactions. There were systems in place to check people's mileage and ensure that was all correct. What had happened was these individuals have realised management did very poor checks, and they threw a few transactions in there initially to see if they got identified, and if they did, they would just claim it was a mistake. When they realised actually these could get through, they started to get a bit braver, and at the end you're looking at a procurement card where there was a fraud of £10,000, and one example was this individual had bought B&Q laminate flooring and used it in their own property. And the second one was really around expenses, and this individual got a bit brave, and not only did they put in a business mileage claim, they put in a taxi claim at the same time. So that was, the systems were fine, management didn't follow through on what they should in terms of strict tests and checks and balances. On the other side, you just have a poor system in place. So people comply with the system, but the system doesn't manage the fraud risks within that part of the system. So, for example, there's an organisation who would only change bank accounts once a letter was through from the relevant supplier. However, they didn't go back and check if this was a legitimate letter. They didn't go and ring up a contact that they knew came from this organisation, and hence they were subject to fraud. And finally, the catch theft one, the system was built on the premise that the scheme manager would do all the checks and balances. What the system didn't identify was that the scheme manager could potentially be the fraudster. And in this case, over a period of 9 months, £10,000 of residents' money in the scheme was taken. So they're the kind of three common themes that I've identified over my years in terms of investigating fraud. If I want to protect the fraud, and this is quite a high level, and like I said before, I normally have 40-45 minutes to run through this. Prevention is do your best not to let them into your organisation. And what I mean by that, it's quite difficult nowadays to rely on references, but how much analysis is done around gaps in employment? How much analysis is done around number of jobs over a short period of time? What we find in the sector at the moment is there isn't really that culture around naming and shaming or being quite open about whether you've been defrauded or not. And what tends to happen is people identify fraud and move people on and not follow through on that. So sometimes it's useful just to go in a bit more detail around understanding that particular individual you're bringing into the business, particularly if they're going into a part of the business where they could be an influencer in terms of fraud. Understand your fraud risks from the organisation. I mean, how many people actually map out where they think fraud can happen within the business and have tailored testing towards that type of work. What's really quite useful, and it's something again that we need to probably look at within our sector, is are we perceived as an organisation sector with zero tolerance? So do we follow through, and our default position is to prosecute, and we don't prosecute not because we don't want any bad press or bad reputation, but actually we don't prosecute because there isn't the evidence. And I think at the moment, as an organisation, as a sector, we're not seen as zero tolerance to this type of fraud. Clearly, I think we're all probably aware of separation of duties and the culture of compliance, so ensure that actually you can't have a system or process one individual could run through it. Linking back clearly, the first couple of slides, I said 70% of individuals were in collusion, but really it's no excuse not to have separation of duties and compliance culture. Raise awareness of fraud. I mean, when I delivered this session a few years back, as soon as I finished the session, the insurance manager came to me and said there was something that was bothering me. And when she explained what that was to me, it turned out there was a large fraud behind that. But that started from a 2-minute conversation where the insurance manager thought, well, actually, there could be something here that has made me feel comfortable. And it's about kind of raising awareness that fraud does happen within our sector, and it does happen within our organisation potentially, and kind of using the assets of people that are there to help you kind of detect that. And like I said earlier, we're in a digital world, so really ICT security, having a look at accreditation, having a look at the way your potential systems can be manipulated, ensuring that they are, well, they're as solid as they can be in terms of protecting the organisation from unauthorised action, internally and externally. In terms of detection, I mean, I was going to jump to the second bullet point. One of the key things is to get a strong culture of confidential reporting. And where I've discussed this with other organisations, unfortunately what we've got, we're in a position where whistleblowing has got a bit of a bad press, and it's a bit of an ugly word out there. And I think when I speak to organisations, it's not a bad thing to start thinking about moving towards the use of confidential reporting and trying to get people and employees comfortable that actually there is a conduit you can go through to kind of air any concerns they might have or anything that doesn't quite feel right. In the kind of protection around them not being persecuted for this. And that's quite difficult, but actually it's a key thing around kind of building the right culture for an organisation. And the other thing really is around kind of variance analysis. There's lots of information out there. How well do we understand and analyse, increase in suppliers, sudden increase in overtime payments, et cetera, and it's about kind of using information that's already there in a more intelligent way. I've just kind of gone through, as you'll see just below that in black, there's about 3 kind of framework strategy documents, assessments there, which to me they kind of need to be in place or need to be understood so that we have the right kind of framework within organisations to deal with anti-fraud. And my last slide just on this session is, and it's important to remember this, it's important to remember that management are aware of this, and if you report up to your audit committee and the board, you cannot eliminate fraud. The best an organisation can do is really just reduce your exposure and understand where your risk areas are and kind of put in process systems, good culture, good awareness and training, just so that you can be in a good position to understand that fraud is something that as an organisation you are aware can happen, and is something that you're happy to look at and to put process systems and investment in to reduce. On that note, I'm just going to pass over to Mark now, who's going to talk in specific around tenancy fraud and his experience around that down in Orbit South.
Thank you, Aman. My name is Mark Connolly. I'm a tenancy fraud officer for Orbit South Housing Association. Now, Aman's just giving you a very broad overview of fraud within our sector. Now, I'm going to focus primarily on tenancy fraud, which is the area which I cover. And it's there's a lot of focus on tenancy fraud at the moment, particularly with the introduction of the new legislation around that with the French and Social Housing Fraud Act. And many RSLs are taking strong steps to tackle this and recover sufficient number of properties so they go to the right people. Now, I started off to give you an overview of what tenancy fraud is. Most people probably see tenancy fraud as subletting. Subletting usually occurs at much higher rents, people profiteering from the acts that they're taking part in and utilising our social tenancies. But there are many other ways in which fraud is perpetrated. Non-occupancy by a tenant as their principal home is tenancy fraud, and that may be where a tenant have 2 homes, so they may have a mortgage, they may be renting somewhere else privately and profiteering from their social tenancy home, and in addition they may be living abroad and just returning occasionally to use this as their home. Also, we've found evidence of people obtaining tenancies by deception, and it's important to try and stop this from the outset. This is where people will present false documentation, can be in the form of birth certificates, so they have these supposed children to obtain larger properties, false passports. And I do know of some organisations that are taking steps to combat this by having detection devices to prevent those documents being produced fraudulently. More common these days, and particularly within our organisation I've found this, is there's been many attempts to obtain successions by deception. Successions occur once a tenant dies and becomes deceased, and there's automatic succession rights for married couples. However, there's succession rights to somebody else that will have lived in the property for the 12 months prior to the death of the tenant, dependent on their relationship to the tenant. Now, more and more we have people moving in after the death of their relative and trying to claim succession rights. So it's very important that necessary checks are carried out on those individuals. And I've found experience where individuals have used that address primarily for a postal address. And therefore, because they've done that over a period of time, it would appear from the outside that address has been their address of residence. So it is imperative that significant checks are carried out to prevent that person effectively jumping the waiting list by moving into that property and claiming succession. One that I've not come across too frequently, but we've had 2 cases in Bexley over the past few months, is people paying money to exchange properties. It occurs when a mutual exchange is going to occur. somebody will pay someone an incentive to swap their property. Particularly can incur for the reasons that Aman mentioned, people being sort of very poor, being in rent arrears, at risk of losing their own tenancy. So therefore, they will take a sum of money from an individual. And I recently had one where someone tried to pay someone £5,000, which would have cleared their arrears, but they would have still held on to a tenancy. So moving on to my next slide, and it just explains to you how we came to tackle fraud in Bexley. Now, Albeit South Housing Association are part of the South East London Housing Partnership. And the South East London Partnership comprises of a number of registered social landlords and local authorities in the South East of England. And the group are very committed to tackling social housing fraud. Now, the funding has been made available from DCLG, and local authorities can apply for that funding. And with that funding, Bexley were very committed to supporting their RSLs within their authority to tackle tenancy fraud. So the options that they had available for RSLs was for them to fund the associations to bring in fraud investigators from Southwark Council who have been doing tenancy fraud investigations for a significant period of time. Or the funding would be available for the organisation to employ someone for a period of time to carry out those investigations. Now, what was found is when an organisation brought in officers from Southwark, it would work very well while Southwark were there, and unfortunately, once Southwark were gone, the investigations would tail off somewhat, and the expertise wasn't there for people to rely on. So what Orbit decided to do was to create an internal secondment opportunity, which is myself, for a tenancy fraud officer, to tackle tenancy fraud, but also enable us to become self-sufficient in the long term. And from that, we've now created a permanent post of a tenancy fraud officer. Now, moving on to a bit about how we investigate our cases. Now, initially, our investigation started by setting ourselves up, by making sure that we were data compliant. And then once we'd done that, we did a data matching exercise with Call Credit. Call Credit are one of the three, within the largest three credit reference agencies in the country. We matched the data from 1,000 properties, chosen at random. We did toy the idea looking at people that are always in credit and they're people that maybe not contact you for a significant period of time. But there wasn't any evidence to support that that would necessarily detect the fraud. So we picked properties at random, some that were sought after, some where there's high level of ASB, and then we did look at the ones where maybe we hadn't had some contact for a period of time. Now, from that exercise of matching 1,000 properties, we came back with leads. Now, they break them down to red, amber, and green leads. Your red ones being very likely there's fraud being committed, and amber leads being that there's likely to be fraud and needs some more investigations. So what we did, we got back 18 red leads and 31 amber leads, and the red ones became our priority. Through course of investigations, I identified that there was a need to visit at unsociable hours, and as we move down the slide, I'll come on to that and give you some examples as to why. Also, utilised the tools that are available within our investigations. Now, social media is an excellent tool, and what I'm finding, particularly with Facebook, is although people have security systems to enable you to hide your Facebook page, a lot of individuals have open Facebook, so you can scroll through all of their images, all of their statuses and comments that they've made within their Facebook page. And there was one in particular where I couldn't trace the tenant themselves, but I managed to trace a relative, but she had commented on a relative's Facebook picture. Now, a friend then asked her through that picture whether she still lived in Kent, and she replied within that sort of comment that she lived in East Sussex, which is not the area in which we operate, and it gave me enough evidence to sort of take action to recover that property. Google searches have sort of found our tenants to be elsewhere in the country working, and LinkedIn similar. With LinkedIn being more business social network, people use it for employment reasons as well, they will be inclined to put their local area where they're living on there, and invariably if someone's not living in the area, that's a good means to detect that. And then you have your 192.com, which will search for individuals to where they're living, where they're on the electoral register, and your general electoral register as well. What's also been important is our partnership work with other local authorities and also with other social landlords and the departments within our local authorities as well. Now, we work very closely with Bexley Council and their benefits team in particular. It's important that we share data, and we do that quite regularly through information sharing requests, Data Protection Act requests to each other, and we've been able to sort of share such data that's recovered fraud. Now, moving on to the bit that I enjoy the most, and it's where we need to sort of work to counter tenants' claims. Now, tenants will do everything they can to detract you from your investigation, to give justification as to why they're not at their property when you come to visit. And I get many frequent claims that people leave their properties as early as 6 in the morning and they don't return home until 11 p.m. And I'll give you an example that came up only in the past week. Now, I've been investigating someone that we know is living abroad and running a business abroad in Slovenia. Now, I did a visit on Saturday a couple of weeks ago, and in the property, I managed to carry out an audit, and within the property, there was nowhere for this tenant to sleep. So I had concerns she wasn't living there, but she called several times over that weekend concerned about a visit from Orbit. Now, she, in that telephone call, claimed that she was in the UK at this time, but that she was going to be out of the flat all day on the Monday, and then would be flying to, leaving her flat at 8 a.m. to catch her flight to go to Austria on Tuesday. So I made the immediate decision to travel to that property in Chelsea. At 6:40 a.m. I arrived there on Tuesday morning, and all I did was stand on the landing with no intention of knocking on that door and to wait and see if the tenant left. Now, at 7:23 a.m., a lady left the property who I recognised as the tenant's daughter, and I asked to speak to the tenant. Now, I was informed at that time that the tenant had just left for work. I inquired as to what time she'd left for work, and I was told 7 a.m. Now, as I've previously explained, I've been standing there since 6:40 a.m. This couldn't have occurred. Even more interestingly, I left my contact details, and an hour later I had a phone call from the tenant who claims that she'd been out of the country from the day before, having caught a flight the afternoon previous, and she was in Slovenia and not Austria, as had previously been claimed. So that just shows a need to sort of work sort of outside your regular working hours. Now, from investigations, we've had quite a lot of successes. I've been tasked, part of my role is to raise the awareness throughout our group within the teams to make sure we get referrals and we can detect as much fraud as possible. From that, team meetings that have occurred within our income team, our rents teams, and also with our contractors. And we've had 101 referrals to date. The slide is slightly out of date. We've also recovered 32 properties. 4 have been recovered since we produced these slides within the past couple of weeks. We've also prevented home loss payments, and just to give you a bit of explanation around that, where there's a redevelopment of an area and we're having to move families out of their homes, they're entitled to a home loss payment, which is £4,700. And in addition to those costs, there are costs of moving individuals and also carpeting their new property and providing other goods at that new property. And we've highlighted those properties on those estates in particular and carried out those investigations where we suspected fraud as a priority. And we've so far recovered 3 properties, which equates to £18,000. And we're in the process of taking steps to recover 2 more, which is going to amount to £30,000 income for Orbit South Housing Association. Another area where we've looked at prioritising our referrals is right to buys. More commonly now, people are trying to buy their properties and sort of obtain the discounts available to them. And through investigations, I've been able to prevent £216,000 of right to buy discounts being applied. Also, many people believe that most people are in credit where they're committing fraud, so they become undetectable. But there have been cases where subtenants have moved out, there's gaps and arrears have accrued, or people are not using it as their principal home and arrears are accruing. And I've worked closely with the income recovery team to act on those cases quickly to prevent further arrears, and that's given a benefit to the organisation of a further £11,000 since August 2013. In addition to this, through partnership working, and I've identified that through tenancy fraud, you generally find that there is some other kind of frauds occurring, and in a lot of cases it's been housing benefit and council tax benefit fraud. And I've uncovered £140,000 of this fraud, which I've passed on referrals to the local authority for them to pursue that. £80,000 of that was from one individual who had sublet their property for 18 years and claimed housing benefit and council tax benefit throughout that time. In addition to that, where we have high level rate and social behaviour cases, we have instances where the neighbours say it's not the tenant living there. And by prioritising those cases, I've been able to resolve those ASB cases early on, which has had a huge positive impact on the residents in that area. But key to it is getting back our properties and making sure those properties go to the right people. I'm now going to pass you back to Ammon, who's got a couple more slides to run through. But thank you very much for sort of listening to me.
Thank you, Mark. I'm conscious of time, and I know that there's been a few questions have been sent through, and we're just going to pick up on some of this at the Q&A, Mark, if that's okay. Just to go aside, just in terms of who we are actually, where we come from, Service Matters is just it's kind of trading division of Orbit, where we kind of help the providers deliver a number of services across that, and one of them is actually fraud management. So if there's any questions or anything around Orbit and what we do, we'll be quite happy to discuss that with you after. I'm just going to leave it as that, Martin. Can I pass back to you? Because there's a few questions here, particularly where Mark, I think, will be able to kind of answer in more detail than myself, because he's closer to some of the tenancy fraud issues that have been coming up.
Fantastic. Thank you both very much for two fascinating presentations. And yeah, as you say, there are questions starting to appear for both of you. But I'll kick off with a relatively straightforward one, I think, directed at Mark perhaps. But Steve's asked, could the panel advise where housing associations stand now? This is a criminal offence, referring to the Prevention of Social Housing Fraud Act. And at what point do we get the police involved? So, yeah, I don't know whether, Mark, you want to pick up on that?
Yes. Yeah, hi, Steve. Just in response to that, now, although it's a criminal offence, it's not prosecutable by the police or the CPS. So what we would always envisage to do is, where we have a case where we think it warrants a prosecution, is we would work with the local authority who can bring that prosecution. So far, I'm finding this quite difficult, in that the local authorities I've been dealing with, where I've had some high-level cases, haven't been keen to take on that investigation because there isn't any real benefit to them. Locally, we do have the support of our local authority in Bexley, and we are in the process of taking an investigation where we're hoping to get a prosecution, where an individual has obtained at least 3 tenancies using different names, and we've managed to match up his identification to show that. But we will also, Housing Association will take our own prosecutions using the unlawful profit orders. If we find evidence that a tenant has gained financially by profiteering from unlawful subletting, then we can go to court and take that case ourselves, and we will certainly do so.
And has that proved a relatively straightforward process? And also, I mean, obviously you mentioned the local authorities, and I'd quite like to pick up on that point before I come to a couple of the other questions. But I mean, how easy has it been to kind of affect joint working, and are there any techniques that people can adopt to perhaps work closely with local authorities, if we're talking about housing associations, obviously, to make sure prosecutions and information is shared effectively?
Yeah, I think the best thing to do is build those excellent working relationships with the local authorities. The difficulty is where you may not cross over with those local authorities. So for example, the case I've got is on the other side of London, and I don't have any general needs to contact that local authority. So I have no relationship there as such. And to try and influence them is a difficulty. Influence them into taking action where it's going to cost them thousands of pounds of their legal budget, when the outcome only is for someone to get a prosecution. They don't necessarily seem interested in taking that forward. So the only thing I can suggest is work locally, share all your evidence with your local authority, try to push as much as you can for them to take a prosecution. For them, it's great publicity. If they can be seen taking action against these fraudsters, that's the benefit to them as a local authority, and it's trying to sell that to them.
Fantastic. And there are questions popping up. I mean, in terms of the panelists, if I can just ask that we perhaps answer a few directly in the Q&A panel as well, and I'll try and get through as many as possible as part of the session. There's another question from a guy called Robert, which I'll raise now, a slightly different one, but Mark, again, perhaps one for you. But Robert's asking, we're looking to take photos of new tenants to prevent fraud. There's been some concerns raised about religious or cultural sensitivities. Do you take photos of new tenants, and if so, have there been any issues? And I guess how do you deal with them?
Yes, we do this as a matter of course, and we found that by not taking photographs, it does cause significant difficulties in detecting fraud. We used to, in signing up tenants, we always used to take photographs and obtain relevant identification, and we went for a period of about 2-3 years where we lapsed on that because the key focus for us was turning around properties at such a high rate. Now we've moved back into obviously obtaining these documents, and we've not come across any difficulties. What I'd always say, obviously, try and put the benefits onto the person that may be rejecting giving the photograph, so they won't want their data being misused. So we can, if we've got a photograph of them, we can always ensure we're only giving data about them to themselves and not to other people who may claim to be them. So it's also how you sort of sell the benefits of that to them. Great.
And I mean, I'll come to a couple of questions that are being filed in a minute. But I did want to ask. I mean, you mentioned how the sector as a whole perhaps hasn't really been naming and shaming. I think you mentioned, and that the frauds perhaps is being identified, but people are just kind of moved on without there being too much of a fuss made, and that's a problem. I mean, I guess the main question is to what extent this means that social landlords are perhaps an easy touch when it comes to internal fraud. I mean, again, you know, how big a problem is that basically people are being kind of shuffled about if an issue arises rather than dealt with in a slightly more firm way?
Okay, thank you. I'll answer that in the kind of wider context first, and I'll bring it back to housing. I think, you know, my experience of fraud has also been outside of housing and different sectors in my previous life. And it actually, what's quite interesting, it depends on your management and the culture that they drive around fraud. So, you know, you'll have some management team where the culture is around mustn't share bad news. You know, fraudulent organisation is considered bad news. It's a reflection on us. So we consciously, unconsciously decide not to prosecute, publicise in any way, shape or form. So
and is that the norm, do you think, at the minute, that you kind of say, or it's a bit tricky, we'll just kind of shuffle this person on?
If I was honest, like, the default, I think the default position most organisations in the housing is yes, that's it. And I mean, it could, for me, it could be the potential issue around how does that look with our regulator. You know, if we kind of advertise our fraud and expose ourselves and say, you know, it was because of system weakness or so and so, this is what we should do to prevent it. How does that come across? I think there's an element of that because we've always been a regulated organisation. I think secondly is, it's a default position for most organisations in any sectors to be there, and you need to shift towards it as opposed to just walk into it. So there's almost got to be some sort of work around creating that culture, which comes from the top. And, you know, that will come from, you know, if your audit committee gets fraud reports and gets updates, you know, what's their appetite to say, you know, what have you done to prosecute this? Our default position is prosecute, and you must do this. And then as they challenge management more, management will probably need to shift towards that. But yeah, clearly my experience is that we tend to kind of identify it, do something about it, but not really prosecute, and we don't advertise it particularly well.
I was just going to ask as well. I mean, in terms of prosecutions, moving towards that kind of level. I mean, has there been problems working with the police, I guess, on that? I mean, in terms of just actually getting interest in prosecuting, because it's obviously a tricky area. Are there any ways to kind of forge decent relationships with police and increase the chances of a prosecution?
Yeah, I mean, it's 5, 6, 7, 8, even probably 8, 9 years ago, it was a lot easier to get the police involved. I mean, we're all aware that the police have gone through a significant change, reduction of resources and reprioritisation. What we've experienced over the last few years is, unless you really have, and I responded to on the Q&A, unless you really have a watertight case where there's very little for the police to do bar interviewing the individual that you're alleging and they take your file, it's very hard to get the interest of the police unless you've built relationships with them through the other means of services within the organisation. So, you know, we sometimes will speak to housing management and say, how's your relationship with the local police? And kind of piggyback on that and let them kind of get us through the door. But it had, you know, it's no different. It's very difficult at the moment without a watertight case to get the police involved. And I fully understand why that is. Secondly, as well, is we've got to be careful around fraud. A lot of the frauds that happen within our organisations and our sector, you can always link it back to a system weakness or a process issue or somebody not doing their job. And the police really aren't really interested. You know, they'll just turn around and say your systems are weak. They were, you know, you made a loss, claim it through insurance, or take it to action as well. So there's not, and I get where they're coming from. So it's getting more difficult to get the police involved. But actually, what that is, an opportunity internally to kind of, you know, look at it yourself, investigate yourself, and see if, you know, there is something that you can take to the police, and if not, take it through a civil action, depending on the value.
Yeah. So it's not relying on external help anyway. That's
yeah. But I think the key thing
making sure the system's strong. Yeah.
I think the key thing here is, I mean, we need to, as a sector, kind of help ourselves as well. So the real kind of loss for us is that we don't advertise it, and we don't kind of say this is what we're doing about it. And, you know, I had a conversation not long ago with a colleague who's outside the sector, who works for the police, and he said, look, what the criminals will do is they look at sectors, and they are actually looking at the housing sector at the moment, around, you know, those kind of very low level, not sophisticated frauds, and kind of saying, look, this is a sector we can go for, let's give it a go and see what happens. And, you know, there's so much more we can do internally to kind of get that perception out there that actually we're quite a strong organisation around fraud and tolerance of fraud.
Well, there's certainly lots of journalists on Inside Housing magazine who I'm sure will be keen to help promote that and you know, help talk about what's going on. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to press through a few more questions from our attendees. Got one from a guy called John who asks, where does Orbit sit in terms of revoked properties v prosecutions? So Mark, I guess one for you, but yeah, I guess do you pursue people through you know, legal means, or is it really just a case of getting hold of the properties? What's the kind of balance there?
Well, the primary aim of the tenancy fraud investigation is to get the property back with a minimal amount of cost, to enable that property to go to a family or an individual in need. Now, certainly if there is significant amount of evidence of substantial fraud, then we will ensure that we do sort of work with the local authority for proceedings to be brought against that individual. In addition, there are cases where the fraudsters won't give up the property, and we do have to go down the civil route to recover that property. But we do our very best and utmost to sort of get that property without the need of that, by gathering sufficient amount of evidence that will enable us to encourage the tenant to give the tenancy up willingly.
Okay, and I'm going to, sorry, move on because I know we're short of time, but I hope that answered the question. I've got a slightly different tangent. I've got a guy called Mark who's saying, I've got a 30-minute slot with a group of managers to raise awareness of fraud. How would you suggest I use it? So if you've got 30 minutes, so roughly the length of a webinar, perhaps just play this back. Yeah, yeah, I mean, if you're trying to make an impact, if there's perhaps if you're raising it with more senior executives in your organisation, how do you make sure that they're taking it seriously and you're making sure that, that actually proper procedures are being put in place going forward?
Okay, brilliant. I can completely sympathise with that dilemma. I mean, the reality, what I found with our sector is we need to make things relevant to the individuals in there. So, for example, I would, if you see through the presentation, completely avoided the Fraud Act, completely avoid anything that defines fraud. And actually what you need to do is talk about the impact on the business. So what I would suggest in 30 minutes is really take some cases, some live cases, quite happy for you to share some of these, which takes it away from just finance. Because fraud, people think it's about money. It's wider than that. It's a concept of benefiting inappropriately from an organisation's assets, whatever that is. So I think what we need to do is just kind of keep away from the technical knowledge, and then you have the kind of act and talk about how it impacts on the business. I always find it's useful to remind management that it's not internal or external audit's responsibility to detect fraud, although external audit have to do a risk assessment around misstatement and financial misstatements. It's actually management are tasked with putting in processes, systems to deter, detect and monitor potential issues of fraud. And the other thing they're responsible for is to ensure that there's a culture of confidential reporting, whistleblowing, to manage that. So I think a good way to start is just remind them of their responsibilities. Keep away from jargon and talk to them about kind of specific live cases that actually do happen within the organisation, things that maybe they thought wouldn't be considered fraud, so to speak. And then really, if you talk to management half an hour, talk about the real soft and hard ways of managing fraud. So the hard ways are systems, control, processes, compliance, ensuring of that. And the softer thing is around nurturing the right culture, zero tolerance, maybe reporting on potential fraud, etc., etc. So that's the way I would use the 30 minutes.
Fantastic, and yes, if in doubt, play the webinar. Yeah, that's great. I've got another question from a guy called John who says, "What's the panel's view?" And we touched on this earlier, but to address it directly, what's the panel's view on the use of civil legal proceedings as an alternative, or in addition to criminal proceedings being brought to recover losses caused by fraud? So Mark, again, I guess that's probably more aimed at you, I'm guessing.
Yeah, well, in terms of we would use them. In civil proceedings would be brought for where we can prove a profit has been made from unlawful subletting. Other losses which may occur, I'm not sure what they may be, but if there are other losses, then we may look to use small claims courts. There is a particular case I've got at the moment where a property had been sublet, but the tenant still is bound by the conditions of tenancy. And when we've gone into the property at the end of recovering it, we found there's several £1,000s of damage as a result of that subletting, and therefore we are now taking that individual through the small claims court to recover the loss to the association of those damages.
Great, and there is another question here actually, which is an interesting one, which I think you've answered online, but I'll just raise it here, which is, what sort of publicity have you done so far about housing fraud? So I guess this is aimed at if you actually do, if you're an organisation that does have a case, do you raise it publicly? And also, I mean, to what extent does it help having publicity, I guess, at a local level about tenancy fraud? So it could be taken either way, but if we can maybe address both of those.
Yeah, I think publicity is key. The most successful cases that we've had have been on referrals, and referrals from residents in particular, because they're the ones that live on our estates. They know exactly what's going on at a property, and yes, you can get computerized data through data matching. That's not going to give you as much as a neighbour would do. So we have posters in all of our blocks. We have a quarterly newsletter that goes out to all our residents, so we publicise any good case stories that get people's attentions to make them read it and to keep the focus out there of tenancy fraud. We also have a Facebook page, and more people are using social media, so we encourage people to like our Facebook page, and we regularly publicise good stories on there. The use of Yammer as well, so people within the organisation can see what we're doing to tackle tenancy fraud as well.
Where do you stand with the one thing that does tend to get quite a lot of publicity is the kind of amnesties, the couple of month-long amnesties that people hold. I mean, where do you stand with them? Are they a gimmick, or can they actually really deliver success? Or is it really the publicity side of things that just raises awareness of the issue that's useful there?
From information received from our other RSLs, these amnesties work very well. However, from my perspective, I haven't gone down that route as yet. I would find it difficult to...
Why not?
Well, I don't know how you would audit how many properties you got back as a result of the amnesty, because I don't think you would get people coming, giving keys back and saying, I'm giving these keys back because I've been committing tenancy fraud. So you may just have a week or 2 weeks where you get a lot of people give up their tenancies. So yes, you may have more. But we've chosen not to go down that route. We have a significant amount of investigations that we're trying to pursue at the moment, and obviously I'm working on my own, so it'd be quite difficult to obviously move aside from what I'm doing at present to look at sort of introducing a key amnesty. But I have seen the answers for and against it throughout sort of conversations that I've had on Yammer with individuals.
Resource is always an issue, yeah. And Amin, I'll just fire a final question to you as well. I guess really what I'd like to know is, obviously you talked through a number of examples, but I just wondered if there are landlords out there who are saying, where should we concentrate in terms of just looking internally? What's the kind of most common type of internal fraud in organisations? Where should people be directing their attentions, perhaps today or tomorrow, if they're having conversations in terms of making sure particular systems are robust?
Okay. There are basically, if any transaction where, is any part of the system or any part of the business where you have kind of high volume of transactions, essentially low value. So, I can point towards like the maintenance, repairs, where there's lots of transactions going through, lots of different relationships.
How good is the sector at managing those contracts?
Sorry, say that again, Martin.
How good do you think the sector is generally at managing those contracts?
Well, contract management is another seminar.
Yes.
But I think, for me,
that would be the area, though.
Yeah, I think for me, contract management, you get it right if you are seen as the dominant kind of partner in that relationship. So basically, they are our client, we are their client, we pay their thing. So it's kind of, if you've got that built in and you've got quite a strong relationship with them, but you lead on it, I think that's a good way to kind of start on contract management. I'm not sure that's quite the case within our sector, where I think we kind of talk about partnering, and partnering then starts being kind of translated into trusting them, if that makes sense. And then you can get into whole heap of problems. So I don't think I'm sure there's organisations that do contract management quite well. I think from the purest sense, there's probably a bit of work to be done. Going back to the original question about fraud, one is, maintenance is one area, development, low volume, high value areas where there's framework agreements in place. But it's really anywhere where there's lots of transactions and lots of relationships that can happen. And kind of I concentrate on those parts of the world. So for us, we do work for organisations in areas of maintenance, development. We look at housing management, because there's lots of transactions going on in that part of the world. And the other one is we look at kind of financial transactions through the use of procurement cards, expenses, et cetera, those kind of things. And they're the 4 areas we tend to concentrate on in most organisations.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm conscious that we've passed the 1 o'clock mark, and Mark seems to have disappeared from our list of panelists as well. So
my laptop's dying. The battery's about to go.
You're back. I was just going to ask you very quickly one question. With the Prevention of Social Housing Fraud Act coming into effect at the end of last year, do you think that is actually helping to improve outcomes? Has it made a difference, or in effect were a lot of the powers there already?
It's great armoury to sort of give threats as such to tenants, just to obviously warn them that if they're subletting, they're committing a criminal offence. And it has led to people giving their keys back because they're so afraid of criminal proceedings being taken against them, which could obviously impact, especially if they're working, etc. It will impact on their employment if they get a criminal record. So it is a good tool to use and something to mention to people once you're aware that obviously they're committing tenancy fraud.
Great. Well, thank you both very much. We've reached the end of the session, and just so people know, I know there's been a couple of questions popping up. A link will appear after the session's finished, so delegates can access the notes and the presentation after the event's finished. At this stage, it just remains for me to thank our presenters, Ammon and Mark, and thank you so many of you for tuning in this afternoon. It's much appreciated. So yeah, yes.
We will be, for those of you who will be attending the Finance Conference in Warwick, we will be there and we have a stand. So if there's any other questions you want, or if you're there, feel free to kind of come and find us. We're at number 63. That's okay. Sorry about that, Martin.
No, absolutely. There you go. So yeah, any additional questions, that's where you can get hold of people. Obviously, you can email any of us on the team and we can pass things on as well. So feel free to do so. And like I say, the presentation will be up online after this finishes. So yes, thank you all very much. It's been a really great session, very, very informative. Lots for us to pick up on as a magazine. Hopefully, lots for you to go away with as well. So yes, thank you all very much, and good afternoon. Cheers.